So basically, the big difficulty with conducting exit polls in the UK, which is pretty much unique to the UK, is that we do not count the results of our elections at the level of polling stations. While it is true that the level of support for political parties varies dramatically from John O'Groats to Land's End, at least in a normal election, we might come back to 2024, the variation in the change in support between the parties is much less. Nobody is interested in the numbers for their own sake. They're interested in what the numbers might mean. Clearly, there is always a risk that once you've come up with or developed an understanding of what you think is going on, like all human beings, there's a risk of confirmation bias.
Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Sam Knowles. Joining us on Data Malarkey today is Sir John Curtice, Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde since 1998. He's also a Senior Research Fellow at the National Centre for Social Research, Britain's largest independent not-for-profit social research organisation. At the end of last year, Time magazine declared 2024 the ultimate election year, noting that globally more voters than ever in history will head to the polls, as at least 64 countries plus the EU, representing a combined population of 49% of people in the world, are meant to hold national elections. That list includes, in population size order, India, the USA, Indonesia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, the Russian Federation, Mexico, Iran, and of course, the UK. And it's on UK TV screens where John has cut a very distinctive, data-driven, evidence-based dash as psephologist in residence for the BBC for the past approaching 45 years, I think. With 4 general elections in the past decade and local polls as well as a general election this year, John's services have never been more in demand. Indeed, it was in the run-up to May's local elections that I spied John hammering away at his laptop keyboard on the concourse of Victoria Station and cheekily approached him to ask if he'd be the guest on the podcast. And despite this year of extreme business, I'm delighted he eventually said yes. Now, in the age of political volatility, uncertainty, and political demagoguery, my observation as a data storyteller is that there are 3 qualities that set John apart. The first is his ability to remain calm under extreme pressure, able to juggle and reframe what he knows to journalistic imperatives, including at 4 a.m. after 2 days of no sleep. The second is his faith in the data and the capacity to explain complexity and nuance simply and straightforwardly, but never in patronising or condescending tones, a rare and precious gift. And the third is his ability to be right, to ask smarter questions and move from data to insight. Many pollsters have been proven wrong time and again in the era of Brexit, Trump, Farage and the rest. But I would say very rarely John. And as an election up-all-nighter for election night since 1974 myself, I am thrilled and honoured that John agreed to appear on the show. And so first off, John, welcome to Data Malarkey.
Thank you for that far too generous introduction, Sam.
Well, listen, it's great to have you with us. I trust it was a good summary of who you are and what you do. Is there anything that you'd like to add? Anything that I've got wrong?
Oh, I don't think I would claim always to have got it right. As to the rest of it, I'll let listeners decide for themselves.
Very good. Well, we'll come back to your exit poll model that I know you've developed with colleagues and collaborators a bit later. But before we focus on data, which is of course my prime interest, I wanted to start with a question that's designed to get to the heart of what makes you you, and it doesn't necessarily ask us about your work. So, could you tell me, John, how do you spend your time?
Oh, there's a good question. Mostly talking to myself in front of a laptop, either trying to write or trying to analyze data. That's certainly the core of my time. I spend a fair amount of time talking to various conferences or organizations or meetings that people ask me to do. Otherwise, when I get 5 minutes of leisure, my wife and I have an allotment in Glasgow. Try to get there pretty much every weekend if I possibly can.
I love the allotment. I myself have worked on allotment for many years. I always like the kind of the analogy of kind of data overwhelm when it comes to sort of mid-August and courgettes. It feels like, there have never been so many courgettes, and you're sort of running around and leaving them on friends' doors who've said they once liked them because they suddenly produce this enormous overabundance. Now, tell us, your enthusiasm and your passion for elections, did that come as a result? I know you studied PPE at Oxford, but did that come as a result of your education, or did you choose to go that route because of an earlier fascination with elections?
Well, I mean, all I can tell you is that my first political memory is the death of Hugh Gaitskell in 1963 and the subsequent Labour leadership election. And I just started following this, and it seemed to be rather interesting. And then in 1964, when, of course, the polls still closed at 9 o'clock rather than 10 o'clock, my parents allowed me to stay up for a while to see the beginning of the election programme. And I mean, my mother at least was politically interested. My father wasn't really. And then I certainly followed it the following day, because then, of course, a lot of the counts happened the day after. And then, a few years later, as a precocious teenager, I was reading books like A.J. Allen's The English Voter and Butler and Stokes, Political Change in Britain, first edition. So that interest has always been there, but I'm sorry, I can't explain to you why. I mean, it's just always been there.
I mentioned, and you demurred when I said this in the introduction. I mentioned that you've got a well-deserved reputation for being right, clearly not all the time, but I think that, is it fair to say that's based in no small part on the exit polling methodology that you developed with the statistician David Firth? Without getting too technical or asking you to give away your secret sauce, can you explain what you do that gets things right with exit polling in particular that others have got wrong? And I know in the last 10 years, pollsters and polling companies and experts have got things spectacularly wrong time and again.
Well, I mean, the first thing to realise, of course, is that doing an exit poll is a completely different species from trying to conduct opinion polling in advance of an election. And the fact that you get one right doesn't necessarily mean to say you would get the other right. Fortunately, I do not. While I use polling information and comment on the basis of it, I don't myself conduct opinion polls. I am involved in academic surveys, particularly the British Social Attitude Survey, but that's, again, a very different kind of species. It's not predictive, and it's field work done over 2 months, etc., etc. Very different. So back to the exit poll. So basically, the big difficulty with conducting exit polls in the UK, which is pretty much unique to the UK, is that we do not count the results of our elections at the level of polling stations. And of course, any exit poll is simply going to be done on the basis of a sample of polling stations. Right? All you could do is say, well, we're going to set them at polling stations, and we hope on the basis of having talked in those polling stations that we can come up with an accurate result. But because we don't count at polling station level, it's therefore impossible to know whether any sample of polling stations is or is not representative of the country. You can attempt to use census data and various other things to try and guess. And the crucial observation that David Firth came up with, it's kind of obvious once you say it, is that while it is true that the level of support for political parties varies dramatically from John O'Groats to Land's End, at least in a normal election, we might come back to 2024, the variation in the change in support between the parties is much less. And that therefore, pretty much any sample of polling stations where what you're trying to do estimate is not the level of support, but the change in the level of support, is likely to give you pretty valuable information, particularly if you then also take into account differences in the characteristics of the polling stations or the constituencies in which your polling stations are located. So therefore, what you need to understand is that basically, actually, the exit poll is not one exit poll, it's two. Because what we do is to compare, wherever possible, the results of the exit poll that we conduct this time with the results of the exit poll that we conducted last time. And yes, as you might have guessed, what we are doing wherever possible, although it's not always possible, and a lot of the effort with the exit poll is involved in trying to deal with this, we go back wherever possible to the same polling stations as last time, because that then enables us to have an estimate of the change in party support. Okay, it's the only way you can do it. That has various advantages, like basically, if the people who were willing to respond to the exit poll last time were biased, i.e. maybe Conservative voters were less willing to participate, so long as that bias is constant between elections, then it doesn't make any difference because you're trying to estimate the change, not the level. So basically, therefore, and then sometimes we do have to change the sample because maybe the pattern of party competition changes, or sometimes, polling districts change their boundaries, or somebody puts a whole new housing development somewhere, and we go, hang on, no. And then we have to engage in some quite difficult work, which Roger Mortimer at Ipsos is primarily involved in, of taking census data and using census data to try, together with local election data, to try to identify which polling station in the constituency might be most typical of that constituency, such that you can use the result in the constituency last time. But you always want that to be a minority of your sampling points. So basically what you therefore get out of the exit poll is around 130 estimates of the change in vote share since the last election. You know a lot about the characteristics of the constituencies in which those polling locations are embedded. And so you then use those 130 estimates, you then model them statistically to try to identify the sources of systematic variation. And then basically the seed estimate, from that, you obviously have from that you basically get a sequence of equations that you can solve in order to try to come up with a predicted outcome for each party in each constituency. So you can solve those equations. But then the other trick is that, if, for example, the estimate is that the Conservative Party would get 48% of the vote in the constituency and the Labour Party would get 47%, we don't count that as Conservative 1. We say, well, that might be Conservative 0.53, Labour 0.47, probability of winning. And the figures that you then see on screen is basically the sum of the probabilities that we estimate of each party winning each constituency. One other thing I should then say at this point, the aim of the exercise is simply and only to estimate the outcome in terms of seats across the country as a whole. Although estimates are made available of what goes on in each individual constituency, anybody with any statistical nous will know that those are much more problematic than what you get in terms of the national totals, because with the national totals, you're basically assuming that whatever errors you make will cancel out. Okay, so I get somewhat annoyed when people say, "Oh, but you got my constituency wrong," and I go, "Well, what do you expect? We do not claim to get each individual constituency right. It's just simply a guide as to what you might be wanting to look out for. The point of the exercise is to get the national vote totals correct, and we're not attempting to say how middle-class people voted, or working-class people, or graduates, or whatever. We don't collect any of that information. It is literally and utterly focused on what's going to be the composition of the next House of Commons.
And I guess really that isn't all that matters, but that's what people are tuning in to find out. And if you can get a good sense of that at 10 o'clock on 1 second or just after, that makes for either an uncomfortable or a comfortable evening for viewers.
Yeah, in the end, the point of the exercise, from my point of view, in a sense, is it almost doesn't matter if the exit poll is right or not. What the exit poll does is it provides you with a guideline of the direction in which we might be travelling, because otherwise all you've got is, we've got a result from Sunderland South. Well, so what do we make of it? What does it mean? Now, historically, what we tended to do is to say, well, there's a, let's say, 2% swing to Labour in Sunderland South. If the rest of the country there was a 2% swing, ergo, this is what we might expect. But of course, we don't necessarily expect the whole country to vote the same way as Sunderland South or to move the same way. But the point is that what we're then able to do with the exit poll, and this is where the individual constituency estimates are used, in a sense, is to say to the reader, well, look, if the exit poll is right, this is roughly the result that we might expect in Sunderland South or in Swindon or some of the other declaring seats. And then basically then the point is that if after a while, not that every result is spot on with the exit poll, but that the direction of travel is clearly that basically the exit poll is in roughly the right place, then the viewer can be aware that, well, it may not be 405, it might be 415 or whatever for a party, but that we know the direction of travel, we know where we're going, and we begin to be aware of what are the political implications of what we see. So that's the point of the exercise, in a sense, is to enable viewers to understand the implications of the early results.
I think it does an excellent job, and it's one reason that I've been tuning in to hear your exit polls for many years. Now, it has been quite a year, and at the time of recording, there are still some pretty important polls to go, including the US presidential and senatorial elections that we may touch on a bit later. But first off, you mentioned 2024. What are your main observations about the UK general election this year? The result was a Labour landslide in terms of seats, but on less than 34% of the national vote. Historic lows for the Tories, hampered by, well, maybe 5 years of abject leadership, but also reform. What do you conclude from this very unusual election?
Well, I think I've got two headlines, one much more speculative than the other. Headline number one is that never has geographical variation in party performance mattered more. It's always been true that the way in which the single member party system translates votes into seats depends on geography, but the geography changed dramatically. We are now in a situation, for example, where the vote for the Democrats is geographically more concentrated than either that for the Conservatives or for Labour. We have never been in that position before. And that's why the Democrats end up with 72 seats, and it helps to explain why the Conservatives have only got 120. By the way, about only half as many as they would have got if the 20-point drop in their support had simply occurred in each and every constituency. Now, the geography really made a dramatic difference. So that's point one. Point two, which is the more speculative one, is I think certainly the question that is now hanging over British politics in the wake of 2024 is whether or not this is the election that finally sees the end of the British two-party system. Political scientists like myself were talking quite a lot about that, through to and including 2015. But then the 2017 and 2019 elections seemed to suggest, oh, no, we're going back in the opposite direction. But, the share of the vote won by Conservative and Labour combined at 58% is the lowest since 1922-23, i.e. basically lower than any time since the Labour Party became the principal competitors to the Conservatives. We have more MPs elected from parties other than Conservative and Labour, again, more at any time since 1923. Now, it's not a trend that's bound to continue, but I think in particular, just not looking at the votes, but looking at what's going on organisationally with our politics. This was the first election at which 5 political parties basically fought pretty much every constituency, and that therefore in Scotland and Wales, every constituency more or less was being fought by 6 parties. That has never previously happened. So we have, the Liberal Democrats, even through the travails in the wake of the coalition, were more or less being able to put up a candidate everywhere, like Conservative and Labour. UKIP did it in 2015, but then it all fell away, while we now saw Reform go back to fighting over 600 constituencies. But also, of course, the Greens are now, particularly in England and Wales, able to fight everywhere for the first time. And this matters because it therefore means that you've now got semi-permanent organisations that are always on the ground fighting, campaigning, etc. I think, therefore, one of the important developments to look out for in the next couple of years is Reform has set for itself the objective of creating a proper party organisation. At the moment, it's a limited company. And there were a lot of paper candidates in elections, and paper candidates who did much better than they perhaps had anticipated. And I think one of the failures of the Eurosceptic movement in the UK has been the failure to create a party organisational base. So, Liberal Democrats, got really pushed back in the wake of the coalition, but they survived because they could always find one man, one woman, and a dog to fight in a constituency, to put up local election candidates, etc. And you kind of keep going. In the case of the Eurosceptic right, it's been organisationally very volatile, etc., etc. So that's to be determined. We'll have to see. But those of us who live in Scotland know that the two-party system has no right to exist, although it's now, to some degree, reasserted itself north of the border. It was destroyed in 2015. And we wait to see what happens now. And particularly, I think, because we are in this circumstance where we've got an incumbent government with a very thin electoral base, despite its parliamentary majority, and which is facing a very, very difficult fiscal, economic and public services position. And if it isn't able to turn things around, and if the Conservative Party does decide to engage in a fratricidal warfare in the wake of his leadership contest, and none of this is guaranteed to happen, but the risk is there, then you can see how one or more of the Liberal Democrats, the Greens, or Reform may be able to profit. And certainly, the opinion polls, very few as they are at the moment, that have been done since the election, show quite clearly that at least is a possibility.
Really, really interesting. Your point about geography is so well made. I remember seeing shortly after the election that there was a recommended walk on Lib Dem territory, which went from Eastbourne to Exeter, which had been the first time that was possible to do anything like that at all. Now, we're recording this episode at the end of the week of the Labour Party conference, following 3 months of, I think commentators might say, quite Eeyore-ish doom and gloom from Prime Minister Starmer and his team. What could have been expected to be a triumphalist party conference ended up as a bit of a damp squib. What you talk when you talk about the thin support despite the large number of seats for Labour? What do you think are the prospects for this government? I know you don't like to indulge in prediction, but what do you think are the prospects for this government?
Well, it's got. So far as its leader is concerned, there's some clear weaknesses. Weakness number one, which is not unique to him, it was also true of Rishi Sunak, is that he's not very good at the vision thing or setting a narrative for his party. And in a sense, one of the reasons why, as it were, people were worrying about the doom and gloom is, well, but hang on, what kind of country you're trying to create here, where ultimately you're trying to arrive at. And the truth is that Sir Keir is a technocrat. He's much more of a technocrat than a politician. He is somebody who believes in doing what he thinks works. To that extent, he's a bit like Blair, but also the talk in his speech about saying, I'm going to be honest with you about the trade-offs. He'll be the first politician to be honest about trade-offs, if indeed that is what he does. But in a sense, he's indicating that he is somebody who is not inclined to come at decisions through prior ideological glasses, but rather to evaluate things on the merits of the issue. And insofar as there's a vision for the country, it's, well, basically, I want you to be back to a situation where, life gradually gets a little bit better and things are reasonably stable, albeit, of course, we have to be able to constantly adapt to changing circumstances. It's almost a comfort blanket vision, which, it may well be it may prove to work. So that's point one. Point two, again, is because he's a technocrat rather than a politician, his political antennae are rather weak. The moment that, for example, before the election, he admitted Natalie Elphicke, the then Tory MP for Dover, into the Parliamentary Labour Party, and Miss Elphicke was not exactly the most liberal of Tories, who you might think, well, yeah, okay, we could accommodate her. It was perfectly obvious that the question that was going to arise was, what about Diane Abbott, who at that stage was still under suspension? It took them a long time to realise they were going to have to admit Diane Abbott. And again, we've seen this in the rows about hospitalities and gifts, etc. Now, part of the problem is, Sir Keir has made the same mistake that Tony Blair made, the same mistake that Rishi Sunak made, is that on going into office, he said, we're going to be holier than thou, we're going to promote trust, we're going to be keeping to the rules, and you set yourself up. And the truth is, journalists then regard that as a carte blanche to investigate any possible, not necessarily legal or regulatory violation, but just simply anything that people might say, hang on, this looks a bit dubious, or, what's a Labour government, what's a Labour politician doing, claiming 100k of hospitality and gifts? So there's a doubt there, and then beyond that, which is kind of linked to that, is that this is it's not just it's a thin electoral base. Pretty much every pollster you talk to would say that there's no enthusiasm for this government. But at the same time, the message of the 2024 election was, we don't want the Tories. There was a complete and utter rejection, and voters essentially voted by whatever means they thought was best available to them to give the Conservatives a kicking. But so therefore it's a negative mandate. And therefore it comes back to the point I was saying earlier, if they're not able to turn things around in what people regard as reasonable time frame, and that's if it's a substantial challenge, though not necessarily an impossible one, then you can see how they could fairly rapidly lose what public confidence they currently have. So, that's the challenge that's before them. And one can identify certain weaknesses that there is in the leadership in terms of their ability to deal with this pretty lousy inheritance that they've got for themselves.
That's a fascinating analysis. And I love both the weak leader and the weak antennae. I think that's a very good analysis of that, and really excellent examples of why and how. I want to focus on Nigel Farage for a moment. He wasn't standing or involved until a few weeks into the campaign, and yet he went to go and get 14% of the vote. We'll come back maybe to proportional representation shortly, but got 14% of the vote, 5 seats. Where do you think he'll be in 5 years' time, and which party do you think he'll be leading?
I don't think he'll be leading the Conservative Party. Question is whether he'll still be leading Reform at that point. It's partly to do with an age and partly to do with a question of inclination. But the truth is that the intervention of Nigel Farage was probably the only significant event during the election campaign, the only thing that really moved the polls. And that, I think, itself was a product of the fact that in the first 2 weeks of the campaign, it was clear that the Conservatives were not succeeding in squeezing the Reform vote. And Farage had been open and said, I'm only going to go back into politics if I think I can actually replace the Tories as the party of the centre right. Point one, Farage has a clear vision as to what he wants to achieve. He has one crucial attribute. He is a charismatic politician. I would just take as an example, he's particularly very, very good at articulating the current pessimism of the electorate about the state of their country, the state of their politics, the state of the economy, etc. And for example, if you listen to the speech that he gave at the unveiling of what the party called his Concordat, everybody else would call the manifesto for the election, that's what he did. Now, we can debate about whether or not he's able to come up with solutions to the angst that are realistic, but he's very, very good at expressing the angst in a way that Sunak, nor Starmer, nor Davey were able to do. He's already the most influential British politician of the 21st century. So we can't afford to discount him. I think, the obvious question, however, is how do they succeed in getting the organisation going? Do they start to begin to embed themselves into local councils or not? Or does it all fall back? Who knows? Again, that will partly depend on what the Conservative Party does after its leadership contest. So, I think the scintilla of doubt is Mr. Farage has been in and out of politics quite frequently, and therefore might he go out again if things don't work out. But on the other hand, if they do work out, he's said he's going to be there for 5 years. He does now have a platform inside the House of Commons. Then we cannot afford to discount it.
I think that's very, very, very true. Now, listen, thinking about both the performance of Reform and the Lib Dems and the Greens, they all won a disproportionate number of seats compared to their vote. Of course, they did, because we have this first past the post system.
You mean they won fewer seats than they did votes?
So Reform and the Greens won fewer seats than votes, but the Lib Dems relatively won. Isn't that fair to say?
Almost. They almost got what they quote unquote should have got. Yeah.
There was the. I saw it as a bit of a joke, really, in the coalition, Cameron offering Clegg the opportunity of the proportional representation referendum, no enthusiasm in the country. Given that we're moving into this 5-6 party system, as you were characterising, do you think there's and yet Labour, what's Labour's majority? 158 now. They have no
170 odd, yeah.
170 odd. So they have no desire whatsoever for any move towards proportional representation. Given that we seem to be more of a multi-party system than we were, do you think there's any chance that we'll get there? We'll move from first past the post?
Yes, but it will only happen when the same circumstances as arose in 2010 arise again. but when the Liberal Democrats managed to fight to secure a rather better bargain, or indeed the SNP or Reform or the Greens, all of whom are in favour of changing the electoral system. Labour, of course, are now officially in favour of changing the electoral system. They voted for it in their 2022 conference, but Starmer has never embraced it. And you're right. The same thing happened before 1997. Labour got interested in proportional representation. They promised to set up a commission, which they did under Roy Jenkins, but then was meant to be followed by a referendum, but the referendum never happened. The 2011 referendum, of course, was not about proportional representation. It was about the alternative vote, which is not a PR system, and it's the system it's as closest to the single member plurality system as you can possibly conceive. But the point is, why? Yes, it's not going to happen when a party's got an overall majority. It may happen when we get another hung parliament, and that the more other things being equal, the more third party MPs you have, the greater the probability that at some point we will end up with a hung parliament. And the point then is and at the moment it looks as though the Liberal Democrats might be best placed in order to be able to exercise leverage in such a parliament. And I would have thought the party has learnt two lessons. One is get a referendum on PR. Else, two, have this held from outside of government. You're being outside of government rather than inside of government. And three, insist that the government campaign in favour. And this really means, therefore, at some point in the future, whether or not there's a deal between Labour and the Democrats on those lines. I mean, there's then no guarantee that the electorate will vote in favour. I mean, this is one of those subjects where there's a small group of people who are really, really interested in the subject and will happily come up with Heinz 57 varieties of alternative electoral systems. And for most people, it's hang on, what it's this that they don't get it. It's all rather boring. And of course, at the moment, one of the political arguments that's now being used, particularly by Labour politicians, to say, well, hang on, the party that we will be giving power to, and this was an argument after 2015 as well, is Reform. They would be the principal beneficiaries, and they're pretty kind of open in saying, well, we don't think that it's in the interests of British politics that these people should get what other people would argue is their fair representation.
Now, I want to switch continents just briefly. At time of recording, there's and we'll definitely be putting this out before the US election. So I'm not going to ask you to make kind of predictions that will have been made real or false by time. But there's a few weeks to go until the US presidential and senatorial elections. I was looking at Nate Silver's 538 blog and all the analysis there last night, kind of leaning Harris along with the polls, and they've run some simulations. I don't know the technical details of the simulations, but they show Harris winning 55 out of 100 and Trump 44. If you were forced to call it now, what would you say, Harris or Trump?
Impossible to call. I'm afraid I did go through it all. I mean, Nate Silver is modelling the data in such a way that he's coming up as being relatively optimistic for Harris. YouGov released an MRP poll yesterday, and basically, yes, they have Harris ahead, but they're not at 270. There are too many states which are too close to call. Certainly, I mean, it was about a week ago now, but I did literally go through the innards, particularly looking to see what extent the debate between Harris and Trump may or may not have made a difference. It may have made a difference at the margin, but not dramatically. But basically, that simple journalistic headline of "it all depends on Pennsylvania" could well be right. I mean, if you take the 7 swing states at the moment, on balance, Trump has probably got a couple of them. Harris has got about 3 of them, but that's not enough to take either of them to 270. And it's Pennsylvania. And the point about Pennsylvania is indeed Nate Silver has Harris ahead, and Real Clear Politics, which is one of the other aggregating sites, has Trump ahead. Pays your money, takes your choice, or just flip a coin. But it's the complete opposite to the UK election. The UK election, it was painfully obvious what was going to happen. It was so clear that the Labour Party were certainly going to form the next administration. We wouldn't necessarily expect the majority to be as big as it was, but that, everything you looked at, it was obvious that Sir Keir Starmer was going to be the next 10 Downing Street. The US election is completely the opposite. It's utterly up in the air, and it will depend on the campaigning during the course of the next 2 weeks. I mean, Biden's decision to withdraw basically got it back to being a 50-50 contest, at least for the electoral college. But it is still a 50-50 contest for the electoral college.
I want to ask you a couple of questions about kind of communicating with data. A previous guest on this podcast, who I'm sure you'll know very well, David Spiegelhalter.
Oh, indeed, yes.
He gave me this advice. He said he was talking about kind of academic data. He said, practice giving good talks. Every academic talk is a performance. Think of it like that, train for it like that, and look at what other people do. Like David, I've always seen you as being a fabulous data storyteller. What would be your advice to anyone faced with building a compelling story that uses data? The best way to combine narrative and numbers and stories and statistics?
Well, the point is you do need to combine narrative and numbers. So the point is, one way of expressing it, at the end of the day, nobody is interested in the numbers for their own sake. They're interested in what the numbers might mean. What are their implications? I mean, either if you're doing an academic talk for academic theory and the development thereof and the understanding of a discipline, or in the case of journalism, our understanding for, who might win an election or what somebody might or might not be wise or unwise to have done politically. But yes, I mean, in a sense, if I've got any skill, it is that, looking at a set of numbers and then being aware of what the storyline might be, whether academic or non-academic. And, the truth is that's basically what you should be. I mean, at the end of the day, you have to have criteria of relevance. Those criteria may vary from one area to another, but you need to be able to say why something is relevant. And there's an obvious risk. I'm as happy as anyone to talk about the details of survey methodology or aspects of the measurement of various statistical phenomena. But we need to be aware that when it comes to the wider public, then it's why the data matters substantively that we have to keep in the front of our minds. And that's, in a sense, all that I'm trying to do.
Another former guest, Harvard Steve Pinker, he talked at length about the perils of the curse of knowledge, which he defines as once you know something, it's extraordinarily difficult to imagine what it's like not to know it. But of course, your audience have no idea at all. I know from my work with many academics that the curse of knowledge afflicts many, even very senior researchers. They find it very difficult to understand, to get over that curse. What do you do to combat that curse? I mean, we talked about what data mean and the relevance, but what do you do to combat that curse of knowledge?
Well, if I understand you correctly, I mean, clearly there is always a risk that once you've come up with or developed an understanding of what you think is going on, like all human beings, there's a risk of confirmation bias, right? So that, you end up looking at the evidence that supports what you're arguing and you perhaps ignore what you don't. All you can do is to be constantly willing to test your understanding, use a variety of data sources to see whether or not it's consistent across data sources, etc., etc. But you have to be willing to admit that maybe while what you might have said was right 6 months ago, maybe the world has moved on.
Indeed. Thank you for that. Now, listen, can you give me an example of the worst misuse of data that you've witnessed during your career?
I'm not sure I can think of something off the top of my head. I suppose I'm rather more tolerant about these things than some people. I kind of go, well, look, of course, politicians will quote, misinterpret, unquote statistics. The point is that this, interpretation is in the eye of the beholder. I certainly don't go around keeping a score as to, there was that misinterpretation or that misinterpretation. So I think I'm going to duck that one.
No problem at all. Now, listen. Finally, what I might call a Columbo question: is there anything in the way that you work with data that I haven't asked you that you were thinking I should have asked you?
No, I mean, I've got no great secrets. It's the point is you're either looking at tables that somebody's already prepared, or you use statistical software in order to try to pursue questions. And as I've said to you, the point is that what you should always have in your mind is a question you're trying to answer and a clear understanding of why you think that question matters. And you need to have that really before you actually do the data analysis or start looking at the tables. Though, of course, sometimes when you look at things, you go, oh, that's not something I'd spotted before. That may be something I need to pursue. But you certainly should be clear. You certainly should be clear as to why you're looking at the data that you're looking at any particular point in time.
A clarion call for hypothesis testing rather than hypothesis proving, I think.
Indeed.
Thank you so much for your time, John. If only there were more people with your approach to using data smarter, there'd be rather less malarkey in the world of political psephology and rather more data-driven common sense. Professor Sir John Curtice, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome.
Thanks so much for listening to Data Malarkey. To find out what kind of data storyteller you are, why not take our data storytelling scorecard? It takes just 2 minutes to complete and will give you a personalised report right away. Visit data-storytelling.scoreapp.com or follow the link in the show notes.